Oxford. Oxford is a wonderful place to enjoy the spring. So Hopkins certainly thought so. He says nothing is so beautiful as spring, and he says it gives intimations of earth's sweet being in the beginning in the Eden garden. There are reasons for you to stay away this evening. One of them, not only because of the spring and it's a Monday and all that, is because I'm from Cambridge, and it feels a little bit like Coles to Newcastle, me coming here talking to you about Hopkins, because it was, of course, here that Hopkins was formed. But I don't just mean that he had his undergraduate education here, starting in 1863 to 1867. I don't just mean that, although I partly mean that. He talked about this towery city. He writes to his mother when he comes home as an undergraduate. He says, I'm almost too happy. Splashing about it on the Cherwell, he says, is the summit of human happiness. And years later, he writes a poem called Duns Scotus's Oxford that reads like a kind of love letter to Oxford, even after all those years. He talks about the cuckoo echoing, bell swarmed, lark charmed, rook racked, river rounded city, and it's undimmed. And as late as 1880, he says, not to love my university would be to undo the very buttons of my being. But for Hopkins, his love of this city and this university was not all bridesheadism. In fact, there wasn't a lot of that at all. It was the place where he found his Catholicism. And this sets in train everything that follows in his life. He says, in respect of his conversion, the happiness it has been the means of bringing to me, I could not have conceived. He dies young, age 44, in Dublin, and what happens in Oxford, this arc that follows through from his conversion to Catholicism to becoming a Jesuit priest, really does define everything. Not all of it was happy. Those last years were in many ways terrible for him. Terrible not merely psychologically. I had a dinner earlier with some of the Thomistic Institute people, and we had a nice chat about lots of things. And one of the things I was saying was that Hopkins today would probably be diagnosed with bipolar disorder. But, so he swung from ecstasy to despair in certain ways. But I did follow that up by saying, via Jung and Jung's account of deep psychological unsettlement is almost necessarily linked to a kind of spiritual unsettlement. So it's not merely a materialistic account of someone's emotional psychological condition. It really was Hopkins' soul that he thought was fraying. When he converted to Catholicism, he writes home to his parents who are very distressed, and he writes then to Newman, who's taken him over to Rome for support, for his prayers. He says that, I'm quoting him here, I have been up to Oxford just long enough to have heard from my father and mother. The letters in response to him saying he's becoming a Catholic, their answers, he says, are terrible. I cannot read them twice. So certainly for Hopkins, becoming a Catholic and then becoming a Jesuit priest, no less, was something of a decision that was not unalloyed in its joy for him. It created struggle and difficulty for him. So, to return to my first question of the presumption of my being here as a Cambridge man coming to talk about a thorough Oxonian, the justification for doing so is that the claim I want to make about Hopkins is bigger than anything that happened to him here. It's bigger in a way than anything that happened to him in his whole life. I want to make a claim for Hopkins which has the character of the claims that Hopkins would make about others when he looks through history, looks through time. Let's see if this works. So this is him, it's an extract here from a letter, and he's talking about, he's writing to his school friend, and he's admonishing his school friend for insufficiently admiring Wordsworth's Intimations of Immortality ode, which he says is one of the finest odes that the world has ever seen. And as you can see here, he says, there have been in all history a very few men treated as having had something happen to them that does not happen to other men as having seen something. And in that letter, he goes on to say to Dixon that he thinks that Wordsworth has seen something. And in that seeing, he says, it creates a kind of shock, and the shock is not just for the person who sees, but for those who thereafter experience the vision of what has been seen. And so I want to claim for Hopkins that he is in that company. He's in the company of the ancients who saw these things, and in the moderns who saw these things too. One more slide for you in this respect from Newman, who makes a similar point, and importantly, as Hopkins picks out Plato, Newman picks out Virgil. He says about Virgil, he's speculating, again, how could it be that something that's so far away, so distant, could be so shocking? He says, lines the birth of some chance morning or evening at an Ionian festival or among the Sabine hills. These lines from Virgil, he's thinking about, have lasted generation after generation for thousands of years, and they have nonetheless the power over the mind and the charm which the current literature of his own day, with all its obvious advantages, is utterly unable to rival. He goes on to say, as you can see here, perhaps this is the reason of the medieval opinion about Virgil as a prophet or a magician. And so I want to suggest that what's going on with Hopkins is that really he has a kind of vision, but I don't mean a vision in a kind of mystical sense, but rather that he instantiates something in poetry which puts him amongst those who really are in this pantheon of the greats. In so saying, I'm not alone, that in 1935, one of his editors of his letters says this about him. This is Claude Abbott Collar says this about him. It is a commonplace, he says, that every poet is vitally influenced by his age, either by sympathy or revolt, or a combination of both. And he says, this is not the case with Hopkins. His modernity, Collar says, means not that he belongs spiritually to us, but that by transcending in great measure the dead conventions of his contemporaries, he is free of all ages and entombed by none. And that is what Newman is claiming for Virgil, and that is what Hopkins was claiming about Plato, and that's what Hopkins thinks about Wordsworth. And I should say that he generally didn't like Wordsworth that much. He says about some of Wordsworth's sonnets, he says they have an odious goodiness about them. So it's not that he thinks just Wordsworth is great and everything that Wordsworth does is automatically great, but rather there are moments that cut through like a vision. So I was asked over dinner earlier what I was going to talk about a little bit in respect to my title, and I should just clarify what I mean by theological poetics. What I'm not going to do is to, as it were, hover above what Hopkins has done and talk about his theology as if I could just take it out, I could mine it for a kind of epistemological common currency that I could then explain. Nor am I going to talk about his poems merely as if they're just word games, but I'm going to try to think a little bit about what it means for his poetics, the way he wrote his poetry, to somehow be theologically inflected. Think about what that might mean. Certainly, whatever it did mean, it was too much for his contemporaries. He wasn't published in his own lifetime in any substantial way. It was only really 30 years after his death that his friend Robert Bridges puts him into print in 1918, and even then it doesn't quite catch fire really till 1930. This is a 1930 edition, second edition of his poems. You can see it's a little volume there, but it's when it comes out, it really changes everything. So Bridges, when he puts out this volume, claims, as you can see here, to Houseman that it's full of genius and it will find its place. The preface to the volume you can see here, I've just cut out a few words from it, is bracing his readers for something very odd indeed. He says that there are definite bad faults of style, and there's oddity, and there's obscurity. And the very first poem that you get is called The Wreck of the Deutschland, and he says this is the dragon in the game. Don't even attempt to get past the dragon, you just need to start with the little poems and work your way around. So he's really putting the reader on the back foot and just saying, buckle up, this is something like you've never seen before, and this is well into the modernist period by this point. So I want to attack my thesis today in three ways. So if I'm thinking about theological poetics, I want to first say something about inspiration and how this is relevant to what Hopkins thought poetry was and how it might be written. Then I'm going to think about two other words of his which are important theological, philosophical and poetical words. One word is inscape and the other word is in stress. So to start with inspiration, I should say that when Hopkins became a Jesuit priest, or he was training, he worried very keenly that there might be a clash between his two vocations, a vocation to be a poet and a vocation to be a priest. And so he burns his poems, and in a rather hammy gesture he writes what he calls, "This is the slaughter of the innocents," as he burns his poems. But not before sending a good deal of them off to a friend for safekeeping. So it really is a kind of gesture, but nonetheless a sincere one, insofar as he didn't, by his own account, compose again for another 7 years. And it wasn't until he heard of the terrible report of a shipwreck, a German ship on the way to America, and the ship included nuns who were fleeing from new penal laws, persecutionary laws against Catholics, and they were reported as praying and singing, "O Christ, O Christ, come quickly." This was reported in lurid detail at the Times. And Hopkins' rector says to him, someone should really write a poem about that. So Hopkins takes that, he's a Jesuit, he takes that as tacit permission that he can in fact reconcile his vocations. And he unleashes this poem. He says, "I've long had haunting my ear, a rhythm I finally put down on paper." And you get the wreck of the Deutschland, and it's something like has never been seen before. Inspiration. The context for thinking about inspiration here is, think of someone like Keats, who says, "If poetry comes not as naturally as leaves to a tree, it better not come at all." Think of someone like Blake, who says, "This long poem is dictated to me by angels. It took no time and no labour was expended." So this is a contact within the romantic context that Hopkins is coming out of, in addition to which Hopkins has his own sense of integrity in respect of his material, where he believes in inspiration not merely as a kind of trope of romanticism, but as something he thinks is connected to God. And so when he thinks that poems aren't inspired, so a lot of Wordsworth's poems, for example, or some of Tennyson's, he says that this is Parnassian. And what he means by that is it's a kind of self-plagiarism going on. You've got the tics and tricks of a great poet who's learned to do it, but it doesn't have the real thing, like he sees, for example, in Wordsworth's Immortality Ode. And for Hopkins, certainly, here is him writing about inspiration as he needs to feel it. He says, "Feeling, love in particular, is the great moving power." So this is what he thinks inspiration is. "And spring of verse, and the only person that I'm in love with," he means God, "will seldom, especially now, stirs my heart sensibly, and when he does, I cannot always make capital. It would be sacrilege to do so." So when he's in the flush of feeling God's presence, he writes poems like God's Grandeur, something like "The world is charged with the grandeur of God," as that poem opens out. He feels God's presence, he can write. But when he feels its lack, or doesn't feel it at all, then he feels compromised, because he can't just opportunistically wait for God to show up and then immediately take time out to write a poem. This would somehow be a kind of compromise for him. In reading Hopkins on this, I was reminded of what Bernard Shaw says about marriage. Because marriages don't fall apart because people come to hate each other. They fall apart because people become indifferent to each other. And certainly it's the case with Hopkins that when he can't write poetry is when he just can't feel God. Later in his life, when things become very difficult, I mentioned in his Dublin, these terrible years, he feels God, but he feels God is coming after him. He feels that God is hunting him, tormenting him in a certain sense. And in those moments, he certainly can feel inspiration once more. And he unleashes a whole set of new poetry. So the early poetry of his corpus, a poetry of ecstasy, feels God's presence. And then the later poems, so-called terrible sonnets or sonnets of desolation, come out of this sense in which God is in fact coming after him. Not as a kind of straightforward malevolence, but in a kind of Job-like testing way. So he says here, you can see this is, he's writing to Robert Bridges, "I shall shortly have some sonnets to send you. 5 or more. 4 of these came like inspirations, unbidden and against my will." Sounds very like Blake here, and if you were in any doubt about what that means, he qualifies it, "If ever anything was written in blood, one of these was." So again, sheer integrity is propelling him forward. He's not just turning words, it's not about felicity of phrasing, it's not merely about some sort of composition in the abstract, it's a feeling of God's presence in some way. Whether that's positive, a positive positive charge of the grandeur of God, or whether it becomes something darker in his attempt to reconcile God and God's presence with his own suffering. And it's a kind of theodicy problem that he's dealing with later in his life. Okay, so that's inspiration very briefly. The important thing about inspiration as far as Hopkins is concerned is that he doesn't become a divine superconductor. He doesn't just wait for God to show up and then he can passively write it out. This feeling of inspiration, the feeling of love, or indeed the feeling that God is somehow testing him, comes up against what he understands as an artist, as a verbal artist as a kind of techne. So this is where the theology meets the poetics, as it were. And on this turns nothing less than everything as far as he's concerned. And we get a word that comes up in Hopkins's lexicon quite early on, which is inscape. He takes this from pre-Socratic philosophers. Later on he finds other vocabulary for it in the medieval theologian Duns Scotus, haikaitas, or thisness, quiddity, singularity. What it all amounts to, what inscape amounts to for Hopkins, is pattern or design, or somehow catching in words the thing, so that the idea can't float unanchored in some way, but has to realise a particularity, a singularity in words. And so I wanted to look at a poem which is not very well known in the Hopkins corpus. It's not one of the greatest hits, but it's the last poem he wrote 7 weeks before he died. The reason I wanted to look at it is because the poem is all about inspiration, or as Hopkins would imagine, the lack thereof. So this poem is called To R.B., Robert Bridges, the man who his great friend. Just read the poem to you. The fine delight that fathers thought, the strong spur live and lancing like the blowpipe flame, breathes once and quencheth faster than it came, leaves yet the mind and mother of immortal song. 9 months she then, nay years, 9 years she long within her wares, bears, cares, and moulds the same. The widow of an insight lost she lives with aim, now known and hand at work, now never wrong. Sweet fire, the sire of you, muse, my soul needs this. I want the one rapture of an inspiration. Oh then, if in my lagging lines you miss the roll, the rise, the carol, the creation, my winter world that scarcely breathes that bliss, now yields you with some sigh our explanation. So the poem is all about inspiration. Inspiration, many of you know, etymologically linked to the word breath, and there's 2 instances of the word breath in the poem there. You can see in the 3rd line, and then it comes back later in the penultimate line. And you also have the word inspiration itself, but it's equivocally poised, isn't it? I want one rapture of inspiration, want in a double sense of desiring, but also lacking, and that need works in a similar way to that. So we have a poem here which is complaining about a lack of inspiration. This is what inspiration is, this extraordinary image of the live and lancing like the blowpipe flame and so on. But the second part of the poem is bemoaning the fact that it doesn't have that. But of course, ironically, the poem is the very immortal song that he said it doesn't have. I think it's a very fine poem indeed. And it's a poem which confounds, as it were, its own thesis. It's a poem which is complaining about not having inspiration in a certain way. Now Hopkins, when he doesn't have inspiration, has very vivid words for this. He writes in one letter that he feels like a eunuch at one point. Gets worse and he writes, now I feel like a straining eunuch. Really ratcheting up with this sense of impotence and so on. But this poem, as I say, written just 7 weeks before his own death, is a very, very poignant example of what he thinks inspiration is, because we get this idea of the live and lancing blowpipe, the sense of this extraordinary effusion and so on. But at the same time, we get this image of pregnancy's turn. 9 months she then, nay years, and the idea that this will take its good time. It's a reference also to Horace, the idea that Horace's idea that you have to wait 9 years before you publish. I tell this to some of my students sometimes. There's a deficit of urgency to get it out, but he says no, just you let it sit. So techne, in other words, the idea of craft, the mouldy. It's not merely a straightforward effusion. So the poem is balanced, as it were, between this hand at work now, never wrong, the artisan, the craftsman, and at the same time, this idea of inspiration. Well, one of Hopkins's great critics, Norman Mackenzie, writes in his notes about this. He says, it's a shame that Hopkins's death 7 weeks afterwards, and I'm quoting him, prevented a poem which has many beautiful phrases in it from being subjected to the maturing agencies of time and critical discussion. So he thinks, in fact, we needed a little bit more lucubration, a little bit more of the 9 months, 9 years we only had a week before he sent it off to Bridges. But I think this misses the terrible dilemma that Hopkins felt as a poet, because he felt on the one hand he needed inspiration, but then the demand of Inkscape on the other hand meant that he needed to make it accountable to the words. But the problem is, as far as he was concerned, too much techne, too much of the artisan, too much meddling with inspiration, he thinks positively damages it. So about one of his poems, The Sea and the Skylark, he says, I'm quoting, there is, you see, plenty meant, but the saying of it smells, I fear, of the lamp. So it's the idea that somehow the scholar has overdone it. But another poem called Tom's Garland, he says, it's a very pregnant sonnet, he's writing to Bridges again, and in point of execution, very highly wrought. And he has another sentence, he says, too much so, I'm afraid. So it's constantly this balance of, he needs the inspiration, you need the techne, but the techne, if it's too much, overwhelms it. And he talks, his final quotation, he says, there is a danger and difficulty of making more than verbal alterations in works composed of in a bygone mood. I'm very aware of the idea that poetry is a special, as it were, psychological and spiritual space to be in. You can't just keep fiddling with it. And certainly, when I spent some time in Oxford a few years ago, I had a good rummage and fossick in Hopkins's manuscripts, and they are something to behold. This is a facsimile version that you can see him crossing and recrossing out and so on and so on. And then when you finally get the final poem, then he writes, well, now I've overdone it now, I've overdone it. So there is a sense in which he's constantly in this rather poignant dialectic, and it's theological for him. So I mentioned about being spring at the beginning, not just as a throat-clearing exercise to thank you all, but because spring for him, the idea of freshness, has a kind of theological valence. In his poem Spring and Fall, if any of you know that beautiful poem, Margaret, are you grieving over Golden's grove unleaving, leaves like the things of man you with your fresh thoughts care for, can you? He has other poems which keeps repairing to the idea of freshness, and this is related to ideas of inspiration, which is related to ideas of love, as he sees God, a flush in the world. And this is Hopkins's incarnational commitment, his sacramental commitment, that he thinks God is everywhere and infusing everything, if only we can see it. So I want to move along these thoughts around techne and Inkscape as they are accountable to inspiration by looking at an image rather than a poem now. And this image is in fact not by Hopkins but by one of Hopkins's younger brothers. Hopkins brought up in a family that was very visually alive, painters and sketches and so on. And Hopkins himself fancied himself as a little bit of a visual artist of a certain sort, and some of his drawings are indeed wonderful. Here is a picture from Hopkins's brother Everin that appears in a journal called The Graphic, and Hopkins writes to his brother once he's seen this in the 5th of November 1885. The letter that Hopkins writes, Hopkins scholars have picked over quite rightly. It's an important letter because Hopkins says really interesting things about rhymes and about his own poetics, prosody and so on. I don't want to talk about any of that. What I want to talk about is something that is almost never spoken about, which is what Hopkins says about the picture. So I think what he says about the picture is more eloquent in a way of this counterpoised position that he's seeking to negotiate the whole time between inspiration and Inkscape, and what it means to get it right and what it means to get it wrong. So he's pretty tough on his brother about this, and Hopkins is nothing if not blunt on occasion. So he begins in a throat-clearing way, and I recognise this as a tutor. This is what you do. You start saying the nice mitigating things before you really get to the hard critique. He says that, I'm sure that in the reproduction some of the engraving didn't come out as well as you have done it, and so on. But then he says, but there are some things that clearly are your fault. So he scale and perspective, and the coherence as he understands it. So this is what he says. He says, I find the image scattered and without unity. It does not look to me like a scene in one dramatic moment. That's important, that one dramatic moment. The action of the persons is independent and not mutual. The groups do not seem aware of one another. This seems to me to connect to something else that Hopkins says elsewhere on his aesthetics. He says this: an effect, and he means any effect, an aesthetic effect, how we experience the world. It's a phenomenological claim here. An effect is nothing but the way in which the mind ties together, not the sequences, but all the condition it sees. So you can't see anything individually, you only see the individual in respect of the whole. This is related to his idea of inscape, the pre-Socratic Parmenides idea of the whole and the part. A condition of a thing considered as contrasted with the whole thing, an effect, a whole as contrasted with its conditions, elements, or parts. So, in particular, then this ripens into a critique of one part of the picture in particular, which is this one. It's these chaps who are having a little brawl. The two restless, he says, do not struggle hard enough. The fighting figures seem not to have been fighting when the drawing was made, but before it, to have been struck so as children fear to be in making faces, and then drawn. So his problem with the painting, or the picture, in other words, is that it's not all working together dynamically. It feels staged and it feels static. Now, elsewhere in the letter, he says to his brother, look, I know. He says, I need scarcely say that as my bent is for glowing colours, so it is for violent action. So Hopkins likes the dynamic. He talks about poetry as is purged of dross like gold. He wants the distilled, he wants the energetic, and so on. And certainly if we think about the DNA of Hopkins' Poetics, you think, what is the signature style? You would think of something like sprung rhythm, which even the name, although it's a contested what exactly sprung rhythm is, you can tell it's about energy. Hopkins defines sprung rhythm like this, which is his chosen meter. The word sprung, he says, means something like abrupt, and applies by rights only where one stress follows another running without syllable in between. So if you think of an iambic pentameter, dum-de-dum-de-dum, Hopkins will go D-dum and then dum-D. So he's putting the stresses together. He's trying to create energy and clashing, not just being stuck so. It's not a kind of pointillism where you just have different parts that are independent. And he goes on to say about sprung rhythm elsewhere, in passionate passages I employ sprung rhythm to good effect. Sprung rhythm, he says, lends itself to expressing passion. You think about his syntax and lineation, all the other things he does. If you know anything about Hopkins, you will feel that this is a highly energetic thing. And this is important because inscape for him is not the sticking stone, but somehow the pattern, the design, the thing that he thinks he's capturing. If you get inspiration, how do you get it into a poem? He thinks it has to have an energy which is held, and that energy is often held by somehow being productively at odds with itself. So, what he can't do, in other words, is have a theological position or conundrum or query, and as it were, just decant it into a prefabricated poem that does the job for it. But somehow the inscape of the poem has to realise the particularity of the inspiration, has to keep it alive and not kill it in the way that he thinks his brother has killed that scene. That is about a brawl, and it's a brawl that's not brawling. At least he doesn't believe so. So if we have a look then at some of his poems, or one of his poems in particular, to think how this might shake out. This is from the very first sentence of his poem, The Leaden Echo and the Golden Echo. If you know this poem, The Leaden Echo begins by complaining that all beauty is going to subject to mutability and decay and so on. And then the Golden Echo eventually kicks in and says, no, under God's grace and providence, at least in the eternal scheme of things, beauty can be saved. Now, a sentence like this could look very circumlocutory. You think, well, just say what you mean to say, man. Why do you have to go all around the house? But if you, to break it down into its phrasing, you would see that, in fact, there's an extraordinary kind of acoustic logic of nesting and knitting. It could never be said that, like Hopkins was saying about his brother, you could just take out a piece that was just stuck so. That there's a kind of agonistic working through of sound that is happening in each of these. One of the reasons I mentioned this beginning of this poem, this just little excerpt, this little attempt to get at the DNA of Hopkins' Poetics, is because there's a charming and very misguided piece of criticism in the early 20th century, you can say it now because people are long dead, which offers an improvement of this poem. And the the improvement by this chap called T. Sturge Moore takes the first sentence. He says, look, this is surely a lot better. How to keep beauty? Is there any way? Is there nowhere, any means to have it stay? Or no bow or brooch or braid, brace or latch or catch or key to lock the door? Lend aid before beauty vanishes away. Now, what he's trying to improve here is by putting the lock in, for example, then you get the implicit sense of latch and catch, so it's clearer. But also, he's just tidying it up so it's less of a riot. It's less of something like a bomb going off or a grenade going off, and it's more of something that has a logic which is led semantically, as opposed to the rhythms and the sounds appearing to having their own energy and driving something forward in a way which is not entirely clear. Now, someone asked me at dinner, we had a good chat about Hopkins and said, well, is it true he wanted his poems to be read aloud? Hopkins says at one point, such verses I compose as oral and I put it down on paper with repugnance. So it's a yes. And when various people say, I just have no idea what your poems are about, he says, but if only you will read them and catch your ear, then they will make sense to you. Now this is important because I'm moving now into the third part of what I wanted to say. So if you think about inspiration, the source of it, inscape is the ambition to hold it in some kind of dynamic way. But that dynamism, if it's really going to catch hold of you as a reader experientially, if you're going to have this rather than a discursive narrative, you're going to have something that catches your imagination, then you have this extra element that Hopkins would call in-stress. And in-stress is the mediation of inscape. It's the thing, in other words, that between the poem or between the thing and you. It's the energy that you participate in as a reader in order to feel the power of the thing that you're admiring, not as a disinterested object that you think is an interesting aesthetic object, but something rather that's generating an imaginative experience in a very particular way. You could think of it in a Trinitarian logic of you don't just stand back from the poem, but you're reading the poem, as it were, comes back into you. And remember Hopkins's words, shocking. When he talks about the shocking of the Wordsworth intimations of immortality, he says to Dixon, when Blake read that poem famously, he fell down on the floor and had a kind of seizure and a kind of fit. He says, we can't all be like crazy Blake, but he says that nonetheless I trembled when I read it, and all of Europe is trembling still. And he means that. He means there is a deep somatic embodied reality to it, and it's not just a purely a matter of intellection. So Hopkins, having given up poetry to see his vocation in priesthood, finally gets his tacit permission from the rector, writes his poem in the Record of Deutschland, sends it off to Robert Bridges, his great friend, waits for the letter to return. We don't have the return letter from what Bridges said about it, but we know what was in that letter, because we have Hopkins's return letter, which begins by Hopkins saying, dear Bridges, you said you would not for all the money in the world read my poem again. Besides money, you know, there is love. So here we have a sense in which Hopkins is enjoining his friend, who is, his only real literary interlocutor, because Hopkins isn't published at the time. He really has two friends who he's sending this stuff to. And you can imagine the sense in which he's finally unleashing what he thinks is this great poetic innovation. Makes me think a little bit, the great critic Christopher Ricks talking about T.S. Eliot's poetry. He said when T.S. Eliot wrote The Wasteland, it ruffled people, it was meant to ruffle people. He said, when I hear people talking about Eliot's poetry nowadays, as if somehow it's a settled thing, and he says, as if rufflement weren't for them. And there's something where rufflement is meant to be what we experience when we read something like Eliot. He's calculatedly disallowing cognitive closure in a certain way. We can't tame it. And Hopkins is very much in that space. So when Bridges is saying, I would not for all the money in the world read your poem again, he's expressing something real about how rebarbative it can be to read Hopkins, how forbidding and how difficult it could be. And I want to say something about this point, rather than gloss over it, rather than pretending there isn't rufflement that you have to confront here, but saying that it's in fact front and centre. Because what I want to claim is that this is a calculated ploy by Hopkins to engage and enable So moving beyond the idea that we merely have inspiration to having achieved it in the object is not complete, Hopkins would imagine, until it knocks you off your feet or ruffles you, to put it at a minimum. Hopkins has no time for what he thinks as what he described as merely the trying on of style. So someone like Swinburne, consummate stylist at the time, Algernon Charles Swinburne, he has no time for that. He thinks that's a kind of fraud. And so he thinks his poetry needs to be prosecuting something which is true. So the good, the true, and the beautiful have a relationship in his Poetics, absolutely. And he says at one point, I know it will expose me to much carping, but I'm prepared to provide prose paraphrases for my poems. He never does that. And clearly he would know the prose paraphrase wouldn't be adequate to the poem, but he's trying to insist that he's actually saying something, and he's saying something true. So, obscurity I do and will try to avoid insofar as consistent with excellence is higher than clearness at first reading. So, okay. There's a reason I'm obscure, there's a reason I'm being difficult, because I have to some extent, sacrifice that immediate payoff of clarity and lucidity in order to do something else. There's something higher than clearness at first reading. But what is that thing? Well, he goes on to say, plainly, if it is possible to express a subtle and recondite thought on a subtle and recondite subject in a subtle and recondite way, and with great felicity and perfection in the end, something must be sacrificed, with so trying a task in the process. And this may be the thing at once, nay, perhaps, even the being without explanation at all, intelligible. He's pushing it right back to the reader, saying, if you're going to have the inscape adequate to the thing itself, it's going to be difficult, and you're going to have to work hard for that. Something needs to be traded for excellences, as he puts it, higher than first reading. Quite straightforward. The real kicker, the real payoff and punchline of what I want to say today is that Hopkins doesn't merely think of difficulty as a zero-sum thing, which is to say, he has something subtle and recondite to say. And so on the altar of integrity, we have to sacrifice clarity. I want to say that the third pillar, in stress, as it converts inspiration to inscape, in fact requires and desires obscurity and difficulty in order to generate a particular kind of effect for us, that there is a particular kind of payoff, in other words, for it being difficult, which is more than the payoff of someone like Shelley would describe a kind of difficult pleasure or something like that. But this payoff is epistemological. It's a kind of knowledge that it enables, a kind of theology that it enables, so that his poetry is not, as it were, the verbal articulation of a prior theological position. Rather, it becomes an efficacious mode of theology in its own terms. It's not something that exists in the world before. It is doing its own thing through instress. So, this is one of the clues in Hopkins's diaries, or letters rather, for the fact that this is intentional. He says, one of two kinds of clearness one should have. Either the meaning to be felt without edge as fast as one reads, that's good for a newspaper, or let's say the instructions for how to use a microwave, or else, if dark at first reading, when once made out, to explode. And he specifically comes back on Bridges' poetry and says, your poems don't explode. And so the fact that, in other words, that they offer themselves up limpidly as he goes along is a problem. So what we want, if we go back to that picture that I was looking at, where he's complaining that his brother's picture is like little bits have been stuck on, and the sequence needs nothing than as it participates in the whole, then precisely Hopkins's complaint of his brother, if you invert that and think, what is the ambition? The ambition is to get it to explode all at once. So you read a Hopkins poem and you don't understand it as you go along, but as you come to terms with it, then it suddenly breaks through, and that's the in-stress, articulating the inscape, which is itself articulating his inspired vision by a kind of aesthetics of delay. So, Hopkins found it difficult to write. He needed inspiration. His poems find it difficult to articulate themselves. It's full of, as he was trying to write them, full of crossings out, and he's worried about over-engineering and so on. and we find it difficult to come to terms with them. I have a colleague in Cambridge who, very celebrated critic, wrote to me a year or so ago and said, I'm teaching some school children and they've asked me to do a Hopkins poem. Can you just walk me through it? I have no idea what to do. So I think it's a perfectly respectable position, and in fact the right position to be ruffled and on the back foot with Hopkins. That's what he wants, that's what he's trying to do, and if you trust your ear, as Hopkins would say, then it will come true. He says if you can't read it aloud, presumably in a library space or something like that, he says at least read it with the mind's ear. Hear the sounds and the rhythms as you go. Okay, so I want to now have a look at a poem, just to close us off, which offers something of a case study in what I mean here. So if you know this extraordinary poem, Carrying Comfort, and if you can see it over my shoulder, you can see the first line has 3 negations in it. So you're in for being arrested on the back foot. This is opposite of Swinburne's Sirenic style, where we're seduced and taken where the lotus eaters are, in a Tennysonian way, but really we're being knocked backwards. 3 negations in the first line, 7 in the first 4 lines. This is a dialectical push and shove. This is a poem, by the way, written in his own blood. This is when he feels in this deep, almost semi-suicidal despair. If you think so, that's lexically. Phonetically, look at the tongue twister and character of it. Why wouldst thou rude on me thy ring world right foot rock, and so on. Rhythmically, we get that sprung rhythm, abruptness. Grammatically, Bridges, when he says, by the way, there's all kinds of oddities and errors and so on. He in particular doesn't like Hopkins's ellipses and what he calls his liberties of grammar. That's not a particular problem here, nor the omission of the relative pronoun that Bridges didn't like either, but really that you have 10 questions in 14 lines. This is the poem, which is not giving you easy answers, is in fact asking hard questions in all kinds of ways. First, 4 lines are a single sentence. You get tensions across the line. Again, at dinner, in our lovely conversation, one of you was asking me about Hopkins's influences, and I said Milton, the great Catholic hater. It just shows how open Hopkins was to things. It's very Miltonic, the wrenching of the sense across the ends of the lines and so on. This is all part of the kind of agonism that generates the in-stress as far as he's concerned. And even if you look at this second line, these last strands of man, and then you go over the line, in me or worse, weary, crying, I can no more. I can, this kind of Hamletian line, I can choose not to be, and so on. So it's a confusing poem. Who is Hopkins addressing? It's temporally an odd poem, the time sequence and so on. One of Hopkins loved sonnets, unsurprisingly, because he likes the compression of the sonnet form. 2 kinds of sonnets in English, you'll know. There's the Italian form, where you get an octave and a sestets of 8 and 6, or there's the English form. In the English form, you would be associated with Shakespeare or Keats or something, and you have a couplet turn. And it's been said about the English form that it puts one in minds of pins and balloons, and you have a big problem, and they just pop it with the enigmatic twist at the end. Hopkins is not interested in any of that. It's agonism all the way. And from this moment here, this Job-like, why? You know that, in fact, there are no cheap answers. There's no easy resolution to the difficulty that he is working with. That Job-like why at the Volta moment is indeed, we have reason to think of it as like Job. The King James rendering of lion limb, for example, recalls in the King James Bible, thou huntest me as a fierce lion in the book of Job. And the last words of the poem in particular is what I want to look at just very briefly to capture this full sense of this agonism. Refers to Jacob wrestling with the angel, moving from Job to Jacob. Jacob wrestling with the angel, you know that episode from Genesis, from Hosea. Jacob spends the night on the riverside during the journey back to Canaan, and he encounters what appears to be a man, but it's called an angel in Hosea, and he wrestles with him until daybreak. And the man, so-called man, refuses to give his name, but Jacob names the place where they wrestle as Peniel, the face of God, or facing God, and Jacob is renamed Israel, or contends with God. He contends with God. Now, importantly, you'll know in this story that Jacob is injured, and And so as a rationalization, this injury, which is a blessing, is a way of Hopkins reimagining his own suffering. So he's thinking, well, if God is doing this to me, I should be grateful for it. That there is something redemptive that comes out of this emotional, psychological trauma. And I should say that in the 19th century, I've just written a little book about angels, so forgive a brief diversion into angels. This will be very brief. But in the 19th century, Jacob wrestling with the angel is everywhere. So here are some gorgeous paintings. I'm just going to rattle through them. Perhaps my favourite one, because the angel doesn't appear to be that bothered by what's going on. Stop hitting yourself, don't you? So in this kind of wrestling with the angel, certainly in Hopkins's account of it, there is no sense in which we can feel that, as he said of Hopkins's brother, that the wrestling of his staged or somehow tacked on or something. If you read the whole poem, you can see that it's coming out of a place here. And this final line is something that I'm very interested in. As I said, spent time in the body, and I was looking at the drafts of Hopkins's poem. In particular, this last line interests me, how Hopkins wrote this last line. And here is the original version of it. And you can see wrestled is in the past tense here, and I run with God, and that's the punchline. I knew that I'm actually fighting with God. He ditches that, and I'm not quite sure, with the extra comma here, but I know comes earlier on, so the knowledge of it comes earlier on. In his third attempt to get at this, done now, we put it back even further down the line, and then with the fourth attempt, this just is a bit abortive, and then the final attempt comes from nowhere. Now what happens here is something absolutely extraordinary. So from nowhere, we now get the my God, which stages a kind of profanation, a sense of my God. He's realized suddenly that who he is actually wrestling with. He's actually wrestling with God. And that this is on a razor's edge because, it sounds like profane in a certain sense, but of course, my God, why have you abandoned me? Christ lies worse than the cross. Also folded into this line. So you have a sense in which the redemption of the Volta, the idea of the terribleness that's going on in the sonnet, the idea that this could be redeemed at the end, is the opposite of cheap pins and balloons, epigrammatic, intellectual twist. But it's one that comes precisely out of wrestling. But it comes out of this agonism, which is in this inspired final line. I think it is inspired, because although you can see he's working his way towards it, this is different in kind from the lines that have come before. And I think it explodes, as Hopkins said, that the great poetry should explode. So what you get, in other words, is not merely, as it were, the simulation of Hopkins's thinking, but you get the stimulation of it as a reader, where we are surprised, and no matter how many times you read that poem, I think that last line is a kind of jolt and a surprise, and it has a sense of being risky, theologically, metaphysically risky, in a way which I think is thrilling. We could say more. The very last thing I will say there, because coming to the end of this time, I don't want to leave on a so-called terrible sonnet, not terrible, but as a desolation sonnet, they're called terrible sonnets, but to leave you with a sonnet which he thought was his own favourite poem. And it's a poem of ecstasy rather than despair. And I'll leave you with this poem as a rationalization for this arduity, this difficulty, this agonism. He spells it out in his favourite poem, why in fact this all makes sense. Why it makes sense that Inscape would render in stress in a certain way. Or that indeed you could work backwards. That stress, very important word for Hopkins, could generate a kind of legibility, a kind of knowledge which would bring us closer to God. So this is his, the last slide I have for you, and this is his favourite poem, Windhover. Windhover is a kestrel, peregrine falcon or something like that. You can see it's to Christ our Lord. I caught this morning morning's minion. Wonderful, so Hopkinsian, the play of minion and king broken across the line there. Christ's double identity as servant and king and so on. So he's looking at this kestrel, daylight's dauphin, dapple dawn-drawn falcon, and is riding in a rolling level underneath him, steady air and striding high there, how he rung on the rain of the wimply wing in his ecstasy, that wonderful onomatopoeic facility that Hopkins has, not merely of describing the bird, but allowing the bird to be felt through the rhythm of the lines, skate's heel sweet smooth on a bow bend. Imagine like a skater who just goes round as the beautiful, majestic bird does the hurling, gliding, rebuffed the big wind. My heart in hiding, stirred for a bird. He can't quite believe what he's seen in the natural world, the achieve of, and he interrupts himself. By the way, this is a late interruption. If you look at the later drafts, he makes it more abrupt and more self-interrupting later on to emphasize the shock, an important word for Hopkins, the achieve of, the mastery of the thing. Brute beauty and valour and act o' air pride who plume here. Buckle. So he's thinking of the bird, this majestic bird, point it draws in its wings. And by the way, the peregrine falcon is the fastest animal in the world. When it dives at 200 miles an hour for its prey, the prey has no chance. He's imagining Christ, of course, the arms on the cross like the birds, the falcon, drawing itself in. And for all the beauty of the bird's flight, at the point of the buckling is when he goes for his prey, which is us. And of course, and the fire that breaks from thee then is 1,000,000,000 times told lovelier. So whatever is beautiful before, this is more so. More dangerous, O my Chevalier. But this is the last 3 lines, which is, as it were, the summation of what I've been trying to say. He says, no wonder of it. How is it that the buckling, and think of course, this word buckle, by the way, has been, a lot of ink has been spilt on what this word means, and the answer is lots of things. It's Christ buckling on the cross, it's the buckling of genuflection, it's the buckling up for battle, it's everything. It's what William Empson would call a single word as a compacted doctrine. Just look at that word in Hopkins, you see the intensity. But no wonder of it. So what does that mean? Sheer plod makes plough down silly and shine. So if you're ploughing in a field, even the most unprepossessing, muddy field, the sheer plod of that cuts it, and the Cillian, the sense of the earth shining, it generates that kind of beauty. And blue bleak embers are, my dear, a fire at the point of dying. You think it's the end, Christ on the cross, you think it's the end. It's at that point that the fire breaks on itself, forgall themselves, and gash gold vermilion. So it's out of the breaking, it's out of the dynamism. It's not about capturing words and making them stuck so, as he would object to his brothers, but in fact it's about generating the stress which is adequate to the relationship of the part to the whole in a dynamic, dialectical pattern, which is the thing which is ultimately adequate to the vision in the first place. Shelley talks about, in his wonderful defense of poetry, he says that no vision that the poet has ever had has been rendered in poetry, that even the greatest poetry that we have is only a feeble shadow of the great vision. And one of the images he has is like faded coals. So by the time the poet comes to write, it's just straining to remember and incompletely put down on paper. And I see this as a wonderful riposte to that idea. It's a deeply, as where Shelley being a great Platonist, imagining that really everything is elsewhere, and Hopkins is a great incarnational, sacramental poet. And so it's in and through the reality of the feeling of the embodied self, the human being in time, that we can have a sense not merely of the description of the thing, but a glimpse of the experience